And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution.
Well, thank you for joining us tonight for another Connecting the Dots radio program. This is June 15th, 2017. My guests tonight are Robert Brown, author of a program for the John Birch Society on the U.S. Constitution, a terrific DVD set that, as a matter of fact, I've sat in on a number of these classes and actually have had a little input on the local level with some of these classes. They're a terrific class. And Senator Scott Sales, who happens to be our Montana president of the State Senate and has sat in on some of the Article 5 discussion. An Article 5 amendment was brought before the Montana State Senate 2 years ago, and it was defeated. And Scott was on the Judiciary Council for the Senate, and he was actually chairing that committee. So, with that said, I would like to introduce our guest tonight. Robert, would you like to give a little bit of your background and some of the things you've worked on with the Constitution classes and the Article 5 convention issue, and then we'll turn it over to Scott for a little of the same.
Sure. Again, my name's Robert Brown, and over the years as I worked with the John Birch Society as part of their field staff, something I noticed was there's a tremendous need and a tremendous hunger for an understanding of the Constitution, especially among freedom-minded people. And so a number of years ago, I finally felt that the best way to meet that need was to produce a series myself, which was called The Constitution is the Solution, a 6-lecture series on the Constitution, which was specifically designed for teaching the activists what they need to know about the Constitution and threats to it in order to help restore the Constitution as the ruling law of our land. So that's kind of where I got my start in activism, was creating that series. And since then, I've gained a lot of national popularity with the series and have been on a number of speaking tours across the country, speaking on the Constitution and also specifically speaking on what I consider one of the greatest threats to the Constitution, this move for an Article 5 constitutional convention. In fact, just recently I've been through, probably a dozen states over the winter speaking on that topic.
Okay, good, Robert. Thank you. Scott, would you like to give our listeners a little bit of your background and how you got involved with the CON issue?
Sure. Well, I'm glad to be on your show, Dan. Anyway, Scott Sales, longtime resident of Montana, born in Wyoming, raised in Idaho. Always had an interest in politics, never thought I'd get involved, and just by a chain of events, I ended up running for the legislature 15 years ago. Served 8 years in the House in Montana, was privileged to be the Speaker of the House as well as the Republican leader in a tied House, and now I've been in the Senate for 6 years, coming up on my next and final session in 2019. This idea of a CON's been around for quite a period of time. It has gained momentum recently. I've always been under the idea and the thought that we don't need a new constitution, we just need to follow the one that currently exists. Few people that are advocating for this idea of a CON, I think, have really even read the Constitution, let alone studied it. And if they did, I think they'd realize that the problem isn't that we need a new document, we just need to elect individuals that take their oath seriously and are willing to uphold the Constitution as currently written. If we would just get back to those basic founding principles, our country could easily reverse the course it's on. I shouldn't say easily, because our society and our citizenry has been sold a bill of goods, in my opinion, that doesn't exist. But the principles that the country were founded on and that we succeeded as a nation for a couple hundred years are still principles that would bring us a tremendous amount of success and prosperity if we would just return back to those basic ideas and those basic concepts.
Well, Scott, I really applaud you as a legislator, as a senator, because I know that you believe that, and I know you really do try to adhere to that. And we've had a number of talks about that, and I just wished every legislator in the country believed as you, because then we wouldn't have to worry about a con-con. I guess I'd like to start this discussion bringing up one of the primary advocates of the con-con, and that's Mark Levin, and a book that he wrote trying to promote the Constitutional Convention as a way to modify what he says are issues with the weaknesses in the Constitution. I would like to start this discussion saying that state legislators from both parties and even national leaders from both parties have been calling for an Article 5 convention to correct what they perceive as flaws in the original Constitution. And it appears to me that we've got a real issue. If both sides of the aisle are lobbying for a con-con, it looks to me like we've got really an inherent trap built into the system. Robert, would you like to kind of talk about why both sides are pushing the issues?
Well, purportedly, often for different reasons. Of course, on the left, we have things like Wolfpack, an organization that's promoting the convention for what they refer to as campaign finance reform, where they would love to see all political campaigns publicly funded through tax dollars, which then, my concern is it puts the government in the place of the gatekeeper on who gets to run for office and who doesn't. And, of course, also the amount of funds that would come out of taxpayer dollars for that, I have some problems with that. But the other side of the coin, we have conservative organizations, some talking about we need a balanced budget amendment or term limits or whatever else. And there are inherent flaws in all of the propositions I see out there. I've not seen any proposals being circulated with much popularity that I think would make any improvements on what we currently have. Take, for example, the balanced budget amendment concept, where that push has gotten up to 28 states applying for a convention for this balanced budget amendment, but it has an escape clause in the terminology of the application. It says that Congress would be required to balance the budget except during times of national emergency. Well, I'd ask you, when was the last time we had a national emergency? And the answer is, what was today's date again? Here we are on June 15th, and we're presently under somewhere in the neighborhood of about 30 declared national emergencies. And we have continually been under a state of national emergency since 1979. So there's not 1 minute in the last several decades that Congress wasn't able to use that escape clause if we had this balanced budget requirement. They could have said, yeah, we're under a national emergency for the last several decades. No need to balance the budget. So it wouldn't do any good. But in addition to that, we see a lot of inherent problems. Anytime you introduce new wording, you potentially have unintended consequences with it. And so I'm extremely leery of adding any words to the Constitution, which, such as this case, won't do any good, but could likely do harm as well. In fact, this brings me to something our friend here, Scott Sales, that's also on with us, got to attend last September. The Convention of States organization put on their mock convention, as kind of a practice run of what a real convention would be like. And at the end of that convention, they came up with 6 amendment proposals. And from a constitutional scholar standpoint, I looked through those, and I'm honestly fairly terrified of the type of amendment proposals that came out of this convention. And mind you, at that convention, it was about 96% Republicans that were the delegates there. But they came up with amendment proposals that sounded good, but when you look into them compared to what we currently have, for example, one of them said that they want to give the state legislatures the power to overturn federal law, where you have 30 states all agreeing, then they would overturn any federal law. But the devil's in the details there. because it says any federal law that's passed by Congress, or any federal laws that are passed by the president, or any federal laws that are passed by the regulatory agency. Where in the Constitution is the president granted the power to create federal law in the first place? Well, of course he's not, unless you pass that amendment, because by referring to the president being able to create law, you've now just approved him doing so. So when Obama got under a lot of heat for his pen and phone comment of he's going to just make law himself if Congress won't act, well, anymore, if we were to authorize the president to make law, he could be making law 24/7 without any opposition to it. We can't speak against that anymore. We've approved him doing so. So this is the kind of danger I see happening with unintended consequences. By trying to give the states power to overturn, you actually just expanded federal power at the same time.
Well, Robert, you mentioned also administrative agency regulations and laws that they're passing, and you've got the same comment, I'm sure, on that they're not authorized under the Constitution to create agencies that can do those sorts of things. Certainly not Absolutely. The way they have.
Absolutely.
Scott, I'd love to get you into this conversation because of the con battle that went on 2 years ago in our legislature, and a mutual friend of ours was the legislator that actually introduced that, and we had to kind of deal with it. Robert, you were there. Certainly, Scott was the chair of the judiciary that reviewed that in the Senate. Would you like to talk about that particular battle and some of the things that came out as a result of that conversation?
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to, Dan. First thing I'd like to just mention quickly is that in terms of the balanced budget, this could easily be solved if Congress would just adhere to Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, where it clearly defines the 18 enumerated powers that Congress has. If it would just relegate itself to that authorized authority right there in and of itself, probably 80-90% of the government would be gone almost instantaneously. So there would be no need for a balanced budget initiative or a amendment, because the federal government's involved in way too many aspects of our daily lives. And the original Constitution, or the Constitution that we currently take the oath to, prohibits the federal government, being involved in most things other than, a very limited number. So I encourage the listeners to go out and just read Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. It would tell you very quickly what the federal government, what Congress is authorized to do. The second thing I would say is, fortunately for us in Montana, if it hadn't been for Democrats, we wouldn't have been able to kill the constitutional amendment. It had already passed the House. Well, maybe it hadn't. I think this one wasn't carried. The one that I think Montfort's bill was killed in the House, and we killed a senator's bill in the Senate, if I remember correctly. But
I think that was Roger Webb, wasn't it?
Roger Webb, right. And without, I think, virtually unanimous support from the Democrats with me and a few Republicans, it would have passed the committee. I'm fairly confident, because I lost the majority of the Republicans on that committee. So, I know at a national level there's some Democrat movement to try to to get this constitutional convention going, but at least in the state of Montana, the Democrats have been willing allies with the more conservative members of the Senate to kill it, obviously for different reasons. Our fear is that we would, in a runaway type convention, we could lose many of the freedoms that we cherish, like our freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom to associate, and also to bear arms and the like. They do it because they're afraid of this concept of a balanced budget initiative that might put some teeth into the law that would get Congress to finally start living within their means. But in terms of that 2 years ago, I spoke a little bit about it right then and there. There was a good turnout from the population in terms of just general citizens that came out and testified against the bill. I thought there was good testimony on behalf of the opposition to it, and we were able to defeat it. Speaking to the convention a year ago, this coming September, that I attended, the thing that really scared the crud out of me, and Robert mentioned this, is that there was like-minded individuals. 96% of probably the individuals there were Republicans, and I would dare say the most conservative members of their caucuses were represented. Very little leadership was represented there. I wasn't the leader of the Senate at the time I attended. There was very few people that were majority leaders, speakers of the House, presidents of the Senate, virtually no Democrats. And despite that amount of homogenation in terms of like-mindedness, there was a tremendous amount of dissension amongst those delegates on what to do, how to do it, and when to do it. And, you know, I hate to be critical of the individuals there, but I'll even include myself in there, that the quality or the intellect or just the brilliance of the founding fathers, I didn't see exhibited in there, and I'm speaking for myself as well. I think it would be extremely dangerous to open up a constitutional convention, even a limited one, if you could do such, that I'm not convinced you could, when the country is so divided. In my nearly 60 years of being an American, I have never witnessed the dissension, the lack of civility, the divisiveness, and the outright hatred that I exhibit on a daily basis in politics. It would be a nightmare of epic proportions. And a little bit of that was on display at that convention in Williamsburg, and that's with like-minded people. If you can imagine what the convention would really look like when it was opened up for anybody to attend, and moderate Republicans and liberal Democrats, it could be an unmitigated nightmare.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you, and your comment about the intellect, I think, you know, our founding fathers were incredibly well read in all of the liberal arts, including liberal history, and they understood exactly how the whole system of government had evolved through the millennia, and most of our leaders, our elected leaders right now, don't have a clue. You know, to them, history is maybe a 10 or 15 year time frame, and beyond that, they have no idea.
These men were classically educated in the truest sense. Most of them were home educated by their mothers. Few of them attended any type of organized school, and at least until later on in their lives. They were grounded in all kinds of historical philosophy, and they knew that the pitfalls of different types of government, and they studied these things. So they were brilliant men that we were blessed to have all together at one period in time to bring forth what I think is a very not divine document, but I do think it is divinely inspired. That it was brilliant, and I would be very apprehensive to think that myself or others would dare to open that thing up.
Mm-hmm. I certainly agree with that. Robert,
I'd
like to have you kind of explain, as the constitutional scholar, I would like to have you explain how the Article 5 convention process would work, and how the rules for the convention are set, and how the delegates are selected, and who gets to set the rules for the convention.
Excellent points, excellent questions there. Before I jump into that, there's one thing I wanted to add to what Scott was saying there. Having witnessed a 96% Republican convention that had tremendous discord among them, reminds me of one of Madison's greatest concerns. Just after the Constitution had been adopted in 1788, there was already a move to use the Article 5 provision to make changes to it. And, of course, he was very, very opposed to this. The famous letter he wrote November 2nd, 1788, to George Turberville, he says, having witnessed the difficulties and dangers of the first convention, I should tremble for the result of a second meeting in the present temper of America. And I want to point to what his primary concern was. The present temper of America at that time, he later talked about being a very partisan discord going on, that there was so much partisanship and so much just upheaval politically. He was very concerned of what would happen if we had a convention to make changes to the Constitution at the time. And my question then is, are we today experiencing greater political harmony or greater political discord than we were at that time? And I'd say probably the second by a long shot, where it's just this week we saw a shooting that was obviously very partisan motivated. We're definitely seeing a lot more violence related to political differences of opinion and things of that nature. If ever there's a time to be concerned of a convention in the present temper of America, I'd say is today. But going to your questions of who sets the rules, there's a lot of debate on that. But ultimately, Congress and the courts have both taken the position that Congress ultimately sets the rules for the calling of the convention. And then once the convention convenes, they call their own shots. They're kind of a sovereign body to themselves. Congress has taken the position that because of the necessary and proper clause, because Congress is empowered to call the convention, they also are empowered to make all laws that are necessary and proper to carry into execution any powers they're given, including Article 5. So based on that, they've taken the view, historically, that they will determine the method of selection of delegates and dictate that to the states, and that they will also tell the states how many delegates and how many votes each state will have, which Congress has typically gone towards the electoral college model on that, where the smaller states like Montana and Wyoming, with only 3 electoral college votes, we would have 3 votes at the convention. California, on the other hand, would have 55. So those preliminary rules of the calling and organizing of the convention, the courts and Congress have assumed is in the hands of Congress. But then once the convention convenes, they call their own shots from there.
Okay, good. Well, that's a good description, but it also tells me why we would have a concern about a runaway convention. Scott, would you like to express some of your views on how the convention could potentially get very far out of control?
Well, when I read Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, it's a very small little passage, and there's a lot of detail that needs to be worked out. And I agree with Mr. Brown that it's going to be Congress that calls those shots. I mean, they're the 800-pound gorilla in the room. They control what goes on basically in the country now. The states have lost the vast majority of their power, and we're not anywhere near equal at this time to the power of Congress or the federal government. So they're gonna call the tune, and the states are going to dance to it, and I think it's going to get very quickly get out of the control of the states that have called for the convention, and I think it's very possible that we could have what is quote unquote the runaway convention. And even though I've been told by individuals that are supposedly well versed in this subject that are promoting this concept of a con or of amendments, constitutional convention for the purpose of amendments, that it'll be otherwise. I still disagree with them. The original Constitutional Convention that was called in 1887 was for the purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation. At least that was the concept of many of the states that went to the convention. And we got something entirely different. We got a brand new constitution. It turned out to be, like I said, a remarkable and an incredible document that was created, and we've been blessed for a couple hundred years to have lived underneath it. But I I think that the same result could happen quite easily again. And when I read Article 5, there's little in my mind that tells me otherwise.
Well, and I agree with that, and I think too, Robert, you mentioned the fact that California would have some 55 or 57 delegates at the convention according to the Electoral College vote. And I know that many of the more liberal states with some of the more liberal positions have huge numbers of delegates. Is that certainly one reason that we could have a runaway convention?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, I study this a lot. I'm on a lot of blogs, both liberal blogs as well as conservative blogs that are promoting a convention. And what I'm seeing a lot of on the liberal blogs is, yes, we support the idea for having a convention, even if it was for term limits or a balanced budget. But whatever the case, whatever it was called for, we're not leaving the convention until we get our demands met too, which include, they have two primary ones that are their biggest focus. The first one that I mentioned before, campaign finance reform. And the other one that they have a real push for is eliminating the Electoral College, which would effectively eliminate Montana's small voice that we already have in the presidential election. Would be almost nothing at that point. Presidential elections would be really chosen by the largest 5 or 6 population centers in the country, and little places like Montana, Wyoming would have really no say without the Electoral College. So those are the two major things they want to see, regardless of what the purpose of the convention was called for in the first place. And so that's some of the strategy we're beginning to see is, yes, let's support the conservatives in getting their convention so we can get our stuff on the table as well. This reminds me of 1787, where there's what we called the Great Compromise of the Convention of 1787, big states versus small states, on how much representation they would have. Today, it will be the Great Compromise between liberals and conservatives, or probably more likely between liberals and moderates, because conservatives, I fully expect, will be a tiny minority. They won't have a majority there. And so there'll be a great left-right compromise. On the right, we're getting things like a balanced budget amendment that doesn't balance the budget, and in exchange for that, overturning the Electoral College, campaign finance reform, and whatever else they have on their slate.
Okay, well, that's good explanation. Are there any real safeguards against the political manipulation by the same forces that have been marginalizing or ignoring the original intent of the founders? That's a question. Scott, would you like to tackle that one?
Sure. I think there's none. And one thing that we haven't spoke about that is of great concern to me is where the courts are going to play out in this. Even if we were to challenge in court the authority of the federal government or of Congress on any of the subjects we've talked about, I believe that the federal court system and the state court system, for that matter, will be willing allies. They want a large, intrusive government that benefits themselves as well. So I don't see that we would get the necessary redress if the courts were involved anyway. And so that's the third leg of the stool that I feel is really stacks the decks against the states in the potential of calling a convention and going through the process. Is that I view the federal courts as well as many of the states' courts, if you look at how liberal Montana's Supreme Court is, would be willing allies with Congress and with the liberals, that they would change the rules on the fly and find a court that would say, yeah, we need to do this. We need to we need to make this change. We need to open up the convention, or it needs to be representation instead of one state, one vote. It's going to be based on the Electoral College. So there's just so many questions in my mind that haven't been answered, and quite frankly can't be answered till you start down this path. It's almost like what Nancy Pelosi said about the Obamacare bill. We have to pass it to know what's in it. To really know how bad this thing could get, I don't think you really have even a concept of until you get going down the path and see how convoluted it really could be. So
I agree.
But at that point, it's too late to turn around.
What was that, Robert?
But at that point, it's too late to stop it once you've called.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah. Once it's called, you're going down the path, and something's going to happen at that point. And something that I brought up in that, which I thought was extremely telling in that committee hearing that we had in Montana in 2015, was that Congress decides on how that, let's say that we get everything that we want, which, like Robert said, I don't think we'll get anything we want. Even the ideas that came out of the convention a year ago were poorly conceived in many ways. But let's just say that something really good happened. Congress then decides how these amendments are going to be ratified. Is it going to be 3/4 of the state legislatures, or are they going to call for special constitutional committees that are going to decide that, like they did with the repeal of prohibition, which would not have probably happened if they gave it to the states. So they circumvented the states and they went around it. The thing that I thought was so telling was the individual that was promoting this idea, Mark Meckler, wasn't even familiar with the concept that had happened, that it was Congress that decides how these amendments would be ratified, and that they'd circumvented the states one time before. So there's nothing to prevent Congress from doing it again.
Yeah, I remember that discussion because, quite frankly, you grilled him pretty hard when he was testifying, and he had flown in. He was being paid by groups to fly in and to be the primary witness or the primary proponent of that effort, and he wasn't aware of that.
Or he wasn't being 100% forthcoming, one or the other. But from his reaction, I honestly believe that he was unaware that Congress had done that.
Yeah, I think he was too. He looked like he had a look on his face, kind of like a deer in the headlights, and that's when I felt that they were not very well prepared, and frankly, they weren't that knowledgeable about the historical precedent. Robert, would you like to tell us what you think about the safeguards against political manipulation by those folks?
Well, what Scott was saying is exactly right, that when this comes down to any kind of a challenge, it'll end up in the Supreme Court. And you look at the history of the Supreme Court, especially on these types of topics, it's really concerning. Again, this is one of those areas where either the proponents aren't aware of the history or they're hoping we aren't. Because what the courts have ruled, for example, there's a 1921 ruling, Dillon versus Gloss, in which they say, as a rule, the Constitution speaks in general terms, leaving Congress to deal with the subsidiary matters of detail as the public interest and changing conditions may require, and Article 5 is no exception to the rule. In other words, in areas where the Constitution is a little vague, Congress gets to fill in the details, even with Article 5. That's the history we've seen from the Supreme Court. Many, many rulings saying things of that nature. We're going to leave it to Congress to make these decisions. That doesn't help me sleep better at night if we're going to have a convention.
Right, I agree. And the makeup of Congress, quite frankly, is a pretty frightening thought, because if you look at the people that are on both sides of the aisle, it's not a very, very deep pool intellectually, for sure. Gentlemen, I guess I'll start this one with you, Scott. Tell us what you see as really the role of the states in nullification versus constitutional convention. Couldn't we use the rights that we have under nullification a whole lot better than trying to call a con?
Well, it's even simpler than that. We don't even have to nullify federal law. In a lot of situations, all we have to do is just tell the federal government no. Right now, there's if there's nothing that prevents a state in most situations from kowtowing to the federal government, whether it be the Federal Highway Transportation Administration, whether it is Health and Human Services. Right now, a state can just up and quit Medicaid if they choose to, or not Medicaid, but Medicaid. They can choose not to participate. But the way the federal government has worked their magic over the last 80 years roughly is to bribe the states with money, and you feel like, well, if we don't take it, then it's just going to go to another state and our citizens are going to be out. So they always have these strings attached. We'll provide for Medicaid. There'll be a 1-to-4 match or 1-to-8 match depending on the program. For every dollar the state kicks in, the federal government will kick in 3 to 7 depending on what it is and what it does. And the states have been sucked into it. So if you look at Montana right now, that we currently have a balanced budget plank in our Montana Constitution. But really it's smoke and mirrors because 42% of our budget is federal dollars. And I'm not even talking about all the different administrative things that the federal government does outside of the state government, like the Forest Service, BLM, USDOT, the Department of Homeland Security, TSA. The list goes on. Those are all functions that go on inside every state, including Montana, that aren't even that we have absolutely no oversight on at the state level. But inside House Bill 2 and inside the funding mechanisms within the state, they pay for 42% of our state budget currently. So if we were really concerned about this state budget, we would start, or I should say the federal deficit, we would start saying no to these additional programs. And quite frankly, I see, after being up there for 14, 15 years now, I have never seen or rarely seen a program that was presented to the state that we turned down. If there's any type of federal match or any type of grant or any type of spending authority given by the federal government, we step right up and say, yeah, we'll do it. And so much of this could just be stopped right now. And the thing about not wanting to beat a dead horse, but going back to that 15 committee hearing that we had on this subject, if you remember, one of the proponents that spoke was a senator from North Dakota at that time. And if you remember, I questioned him, and if you remember, they were, at that time, prior to the collapse of oil and the collapse of the Bakken, North Dakota was flush with cash more than any other state in the union. In fact, they had so much cash they had on their ballot a number of years ago that they were proposing to eliminate all property tax in the state. I don't know if you know that or if you saw that. It was turned down by the voters. But anyway, that's how much money they had. And I asked at that time of this senator, with all this bonanza of windfall of revenue that's came into the state because of your resource extraction with the money came in from the oil extraction, have you done anything to curtail the amount of influence the federal government has on your state budget? Have you started to trim the sales? Have you started to trim back the federal government component so that you might be more autonomous to back up this idea that you want a balanced budget? Because quite frankly, if the federal government was to start balancing its budget, the states like Montana, North Dakota would be the worst hurt because we have the highest dependency of most states in terms of the percentage of the budget that the federal government pays for. And the answer, of course, was no. We're still taking every single dollar that the federal government has to offer, even though we're telling the federal government to be the adult in the room and turn off the spigot, turn off this line of money. The states still have the authority to do this if they really want it. That's what's so surprising and so odd about this whole argument, is that if they want to say no to the federal government spending that's out of control, the states, by and large, can stop a lot of it right now.
Mm-hmm. They could, and you're absolutely right. I mean, one of the things that the both parties are always bragging about in the state of Montana is how they balance the budget. Well, take that 42% out, and all of a sudden things don't look quite as balanced as
there'd be weeping and gnashing of teeth, Dan, unlike you've ever heard.
Oh boy, and the thing that's so funny about it is that they don't seem to see just exactly how much control the federal government has over everything they do because of that bribery. And that's really what it is. It's bribery. Robert, I'd like to see what you think about the idea of nullification, because I know the John Birch Society's done a lot of research and written quite a bit about that, and how that would be a better substitute for changes without going through an Article 5 convention.
Absolutely. And first, for a foundation on this topic, when we talk about how to rein in the federal government, when they've clearly overstepped their bounds of the Constitution, the Founding Fathers never pointed to Article 5 as the solution to reining in a government that ignores the Constitution. Every time you see them talking about using Article 5, it's in the context of, if there are errors discovered in the Constitution, this is how you correct those errors. Every time. Every time I've ever seen any statement, and I have yet to run across one that doesn't include that provision. On the other hand, when you see them talking about how to rein in overstepping of constitutional bounds, Madison's Federalist 46, for example, he talks about two key nullification concepts. The first one is what Scott Sales was just talking about, the right of saying no. He says, Madison's words are, refusal to cooperate with the officers of the Union. There's nothing in the Constitution that requires the state to be complicit in implementing unconstitutional law. We can simply say we're not going to take part in this. We're not going to help implement this. That's the first step. The other one Madison talks about is erecting legislative devices that will present obstructions to the implementation of these unconstitutional laws. These are two different levels of nullification. But all throughout their writings, as they talk about what we're supposed to do when the federal government oversteps their bounds, most of it is nullification type ideas. The other thing I want to point to is when our founding fathers were actually faced with this type of a situation, with the, for example, 1798 Alien and Sedition Act, which was clearly a violation of constitutional enumeration of powers, the reaction of Jefferson and Madison was not to turn to Article 5 and let's make changes to the Constitution. They turned to what I call Article 6, which is nullification. Article 6, there are two clauses in there that really define this concept of nullification. The first one is the Supremacy Clause. Article 6, Clause 2 says that the Constitution is supreme, and all laws made in pursuance thereof, in pursuance of the Constitution, laws that are made in following the Constitution are supreme. And Hamilton in Federalist 33 tells us what this means is laws that are not in pursuance are merely acts of usurpation and will deserve to be treated as such, are his words. They're not laws at all. And nearly 200 years of court rulings have said the same thing, that anytime you have a law passed by Congress which is not in keeping with their enumerated powers, such as Article 1, Section 8, that Scott Sales mentioned, then it's not a law at all. We've seen right from late 1700s up until just recently, the Supreme Court has made that ruling over and over again. These are not laws. And so that is where nullification comes in. When the federal government has overstepped their bounds, they're passing as laws things that don't actually have any authority to be law, then the states are supposed to step up and refuse to implement these. We're not going to help implement them, and so on. That brings me to the other part of Article 6, which is Article 6, Clause 3, the oath of office. The oath of office is required for everyone in government positions, whether it's federal, state, or local, whether they're elected or appointed, to swear an oath to uphold the federal Constitution. And in Federalist 44, James Madison poses the question, why are our state-level officials required to swear an oath to the federal Constitution? What does the federal Constitution have to do with a state governor or a state legislator? And his answer is, it becomes their duty to give effect to the Constitution, to make sure it's effective. They're the ones that are the enforcers, in his words. And if we feel today the Constitution has not been effective in restraining federal power, Madison would put at least some of the blame at our governors and state legislators for not holding them accountable to it. That really is nullification, which I refer to as the Article 6 solution. We need to adhere to the true meaning of the Supremacy Clause and the oath of office, both found in Article 6.
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely right. That's a great explanation. One of the things that we keep hearing from the progressives on both sides of the aisle is that the Constitution is a dated document in that it was okay for the time, but we need to move on, and we need to move into a more contemporary document that better reflects the conditions of the country the way it is right now. I know what you guys are going to say, and I appreciate the fact that you're going to say it. I know right up front, but please tell our listeners the fallacy of that absolutely stupid statement.
Yeah, I'd like to take a poke at this one. It's such an easy one to hit out of the park, Dan. Right off the bat, it's this concept that you hear that now the Constitution's a living document, that it changes by itself according to the societal norms and what's acceptable, and technology advances. So it just needs to morph as our country has changed. And the easiest argument against that is, if that's the case, why do we have Article 5 in the Constitution whatsoever? Why did the founders give us the ability, either via Congress or via this constitutional convention concept, to make modifications to the Constitution? And why have we changed it 20-some times, if in fact it is a living document? It's not a living document. The tried and true principles of that day are just as applicable as they are of that day as they are today. And they gave us the ability to make changes to the Constitution just for those reasons, because technology does change and societal norms do change, but they wanted it to be difficult and they wanted it to be controlled. And they didn't want an oligarchy of courts to dictate to the people what the Constitution meant. So it's very logical that because of Article 5, they never saw or never thought that the document was a living document to be changed by the sheer whims of society on any given moment.
Excellent. Robert,
Absolutely.
I'm sure you want to weigh in on this too.
I would love to. And there are really two different things I want to point to historically that really back this argument that Scott Sales is making there. The first one is George Washington's marvelous farewell address. If you've never read that, I highly recommend any of the listeners to look up Washington's farewell address. Many warnings that are very pertinent to our day. One of them, he says, if, in the opinion of the people, the distribution of powers by the Constitution is in any particular wrong, if they made some mistakes or need to update the Constitution, he then goes on to say, let it be corrected by the amendment process as the Constitution designates. But let it not be by usurpation, just simply stealing the power and let it happen anyway. For this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, he says. It is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. Solemn warning there from Washington. We don't just let them get away with it because we think they should have the power to do it. You formally document it with an amendment, let the states vote on it, and so on. The other thing I want to point to on this Constitution outdated concept is that really exposes a misunderstanding of how the Constitution is supposed to work in the first place. Originally, Federalist 45, James Madison tells us the powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined. And these will primarily be in foreign affairs such as war, peace, negotiation, and trade. The powers left to the states are many and indefinite and have to do with the daily lives of the people. Now, which of those two need to change with times, foreign affairs or dealing with the daily lives of the people? Well, obviously, the second one is the one that needs to have more flexibility. As times change and people's needs change and things like that, the powers that were supposed to be left to the states are the powers that we would have a regular need to maybe make some modifications to. Whereas war, peace, negotiation, trade, things like that is very timeless, making the Constitution and the powers that were properly left to the federal government as also being very timeless, that there's no need to change on that level. What we do want to be active and responsive to the people are the states. And so with that, we really need to turn back to the states having the power they were intended, and then they can update how they deal with changing needs of the people.
Absolutely right, because the bottom line is the citizen in our country is intended to be the sovereign, and the individual is the highest form of liberty in the country, and we're not intended to be a top-down government. We're intended to be very much a bottom-up government of, by, and for the people. With that, I'd like to mention the fact that I've been attempting to get Ken Ivory, who has been one of the strongest proponents of a CONCON, to come on the radio show to debate this issue with you, Robert, and I think, Scott, you would be an excellent person to be involved in that same discussion, and I want our listeners to know that offer is very much open, and Robert, I think you would very much welcome that, and I think, Scott, you probably would too, because we would like to have the opposite side come on and talk about these issues in a formal, let's call it a debate format, that we can hear both sides at the same time, and we can have our listeners make the decision for themselves. And I think the decision would be pretty clear. Robert, how close are we to having a CONCON because of the number of states that have signed on to this, and how close are we to having the required number of states to make that, force that to happen?
At present count, we have 28 states that are on record applying for a convention. And as you know, it requires 34 states to trigger Congress then calling the convention. So we're 6 states away presently. That's a constantly changing number. We have some states add on, a few more drop out, and so on. But we're back to 28 presently.
Okay, and how many states currently have legislation in their state that is being determined at this point? And really, who are the key states that we need to have our listeners alert the citizens in those states?
I don't have that off the top of my head, exactly which states are the primary ones. I know Montana is one of the key states that they are targeting or trying to get on board for a convention. I don't recall offhand all the other ones that are their primary targets at this time.
Okay, well, I know Texas. I believe Texas is one of them. And
yeah, Texas just passed their application.
Okay.
So they're already one of the 28 that's on board.
Which really surprises me because, normally I would have thought they would be one of the groups that would fight it the hardest. But, at the same time, it's being promoted by conservatives, self-proclaimed conservatives, and as a way to balance the budget, and your points are extremely well taken. How do we expose the traps that are built into this system, and how do we educate average citizens? And I'll ask both of you gentlemen to weigh in on that, because there's got to be a way that we can expand the effort to kill the CONCON.
Well, it's exactly what you're doing right here, Dan. It's just have an open dialogue with individuals and give them the other side of the story. I understand why this movement has got traction and that why people are attracted to it is because of the outright frustration that they feel that they're being ignored by Congress and by their duly elected individuals, and they want to do something. These are good people, by and large, that are proponents of this idea. They're not the enemy. They're good, solid citizens that care about their country and care about what's doing right, and they're frustrated and they are hoping for a home run here. And that's the fallacy. That's the drawback. That's the part that they don't quite grasp, is that it took us 100 years to get in the situation that we're currently in, a little over 100 now. And it's going to take us a long time if we start making good decisions to get us back to where the country belongs. The populace has been so dumbed down by our public education system in terms of civics and U.S. history that they don't have a real concept of what we're talking about here, what Robert's brought up and what I've talked about. And we need to just educate them. I commend you for having this topic on your show tonight. And I'm thankful that there's individuals like Robert that are out there that are willing to travel around the country and educate the populace so that people have the facts and figures and that they can think about it intellectually and be articulate in terms of their defense of the Constitution in its current form. So it's just that simple. I think Mark Levin, if myself would probably agree with him 95% of the time when I listen to his show. This is just one area that, for whatever reason, I can't quite figure it, why we see this subject so much differently. But I think it's frustration with the current Congress. But you'd have to remember, even if we passed these amendments, and they were good amendments, which I have serious reservations, it's the same people that have obliterated the Constitution and don't obey the oath that they take that would be in charge of these amendments too. So I think that they would just give lip service to whatever, amendment, regardless of how good it was, just like they do currently to the current Constitution.
I agree. Yep, I sure agree. Robert, how would you see this, and what role would you see the John Birch Society? I know they've been at the forefront of groups battling against the CON, but how would you address this? How do we educate the average citizen?
Absolutely. And as the founder of the John Birch Society always said, education is the key. I would see two primary areas that are needed for education. And like Scott was saying, radio shows like this is one great avenue. But the two areas I see, number one, we need to understand the dangers of this Article 5 convention like we're talking about today. I've recently created two different videos that are available on YouTube. One of them is called Change It or Obey It, Why the Constitution is the Solution, which explains a lot of the dangers. The other one is the Article 5 convention, What Are They Not Telling You? And both of those go into a lot of additional information to help people understand what they need to hear from the other side that's opposing this convention. There's a lot of money being poured into promoting the convention, but people need to see both sides. The other thing that people really need to understand is the Constitution itself. Because when we understand the Constitution and demand adherence to it, then Congress will follow it. It's really that simple. That's the only reason they don't follow it today is very few people know what it says, so they're not held accountable to it. With that one change, with more people, it doesn't even take a majority, but a larger portion of society understanding and demanding adherence to the Constitution would totally change the makeup of Congress, and Congress has the power to change the rest of the federal government. It's a very simple solution, but it takes a lot of work to get there. And so the main thing I encourage everyone to do is learn the Constitution for themselves and then do all they can to help educate their friends and neighbors on the topic as well. Of course, I'd recommend my own Constitution series as one that was designed for that purpose, The Constitution is the Solution, which is also available to be watched online on YouTube.
Right, and incidentally, our listeners can go to our website, and all this information is available on the website. There are different locations that you can go to, and you can order, and you can also go to jbs.org, and that will give you the ability to order that Constitution is a Solution DVD set, and I would highly recommend that. I've sat through that class. In fact, I've helped as a teacher on those classes a number of times, and it does a really good job of explaining why we need to adhere to our Constitution. Well, gentlemen, it's time to end the show, but I want to thank you both, and I want to say with absolutely no reservation, it is a real honor to know both of you gentlemen and to count you as my friends and to have your wisdom and your vision on this show. And I think it ended up being probably one of the better discussions on the Article 5 convention that has happened in this country in quite a long time. So I thank you both for being on the show, and I thank our listeners for tuning in to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and I hope that you will join us again next week for another show on Connecting the Dots. Thank you, and good evening.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That concludes this week's call for Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. God bless. Good night. We'll see you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific. Bye-bye.